Happy Place Home Studios.
Hello and welcome back to Happy Place Home Studio. This is part 2 of a very short series on exporting your song mix to an outside mixing resource or mixing engineer. And in part 2, we are actually going to interview a real mixing engineer, producer, sound engineer, my good friend Gary Wagner. And we'll talk about many of the issues that I brought up in part 1 of this series and a little more. And you'll learn some interesting things. So let's jump right in to our Zoom interview regarding exporting your song mix to a mix engineer. All right, I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Gary Wagner for the first time to Happy Place Home Studio, and I hope it will not be the last time because Gary's a person that has a lot of knowledge about recording. And Gary, welcome to Happy Place Home Studio.
Thanks, Kent. Happy to be here at the Happy Place.
Well, the purpose of this video that we're creating here is part of a series that I've created on getting your music into the cloud. And as a kind of a sidebar of that, I'm doing that with the actual music that our group back in the day, about 20 years ago, recorded. And as part of that, I'm actually redoing one of the songs, and that song's called Love Gamble. And so as part of the education process, I'm saying, here's what you need to do to work with an outside mixing source. But I'm very fortunate to actually have a friend, Gary Wagner, that is very, very knowledgeable in these areas. And he and I worked together pretty successfully for a couple of years at a company called Gas Powered Games, working on multiple titles, but particularly one called Supreme Commander. Obviously, we don't want to deep dive on that one, Gary, but
have another session all about that.
Yeah, multiple sessions, right? In that process, I just learned that Gary had a tremendous background in production of many types, video games, but also music. So Gary, tell us a little bit about that background that you've got and some of the projects that you worked on.
Sure, happy to do so. So actually, my first career before becoming a video game producer, I was in the music business, and I am a professional recording and mixing engineer. I've also done I've produced a couple records, but my main focus was for engineering and mixing. I was a staff engineer at Conway Studios in Los Angeles, which was one of the top studios in the world, actually. And also, have worked on a lot. When I look back on all the records I worked on, lots of big records. I worked on U2, Rattle and Hum. I worked with Tom Petty. I worked with David Lee Roth. This was all in the 80s, so worked with a lot of the big hair metal bands. So Motley Crue, Poison, LA Guns, a really broad spectrum of artists I worked with. I also worked with a lot of R&B legends, so like Gladys Knight, Natalie Cole, Michael Bolton. The list kind of goes on and on. I'm really happy and proud when I look back over my career in music about all the big records that I worked on, and just being able to work with people like Smokey Robinson, just pretty much great experiences to have over the years. So, and now, I do, my main career is producing video games, but I still mix music, and my passion for music has not changed over the years. So, it's just a great background to have, and I'm really thankful for all those years of wonderful experience working with all those top artists.
And I know that you're very happy to be able to add the followers of the shoe to that amazing list of artists that you just talked about.
I am actually. So I'm currently, Kent had asked me to to mix a song of his for this series, and also, he wants to release this record that he created years ago, in the cloud and on the streaming services. So really, it's been fun working together with Kent and working on the song "Love Gamble" for him.
Now I know in video game production, I should say, that music is a huge part of video gaming, and some really interesting aspects of that intimate relationship between the game and the music. And I recall from our time together at Gas Powered Games that you really spent a lot of time working with the talented music directors that we had on multiple titles.
Yes.
And obviously your experience would have helped out a lot there as well.
That's a good point, and that made me really happy. So everything I learned in the music business, making records and recording and mixing bands and artists and songs and albums, that's still a portion of what I do, right? Because there is music and there is sound effects and voiceover in video games. So so I work very closely with the composers. Really, obviously, I work closely with the audio directors and the sound designers, and they do love the fact that I'm kind of a rare spawn in the video game industry, because I'm a video game producer that has this professional audio background, and it really comes in handy, and it's just something I love to do still. So happy to do that for video games as well as mixing music as well.
So Gary, your professional background, I got to be honest, is pretty intimidating. My audience is people at home studios making their own recording. Many of them are very, very, very talented. But they, in working with an outside mixing producer or engineer, they may or may not have access to someone with your background. But I know that you do work with these days, just people like myself, not necessarily recording artists with those kind of credentials, but
indie bands, and I do run across. There are lots of people actually in the video game business who create music and love music, and I usually seek them out at whatever company I'm working at and end up volunteering to mix some music for them. And it's this one band actually years ago when I was a senior producer at Tryon Studios. There was the lead character animator had an indie band, and I ended up mixing some songs for them. And then over the course of, several years, I must have mixed 40 songs for them. And it was just fun, it's something, it keeps my chops up. And, I just love working with up and coming folks and sharing my knowledge and years in the industry. So, yep, it is still something I love to do, and just do it in my spare time now.
So these days, someone who's recorded and wants to think about having someone outside mix their work, I've tried to address some of the reasons that people would want to do that, and obviously they include, having that another ear on the music that might come up with a completely different take on a mix. As with myself working with you, you've got some tools and some plugins, and more importantly, the knowledge of how to use them to get some really top results. But, what would you add to that list of why should an indie or a home studio, recording artist work with an outside mixing engineer?
Well, I think there's a few reasons. One is you sort of touched on it. It's getting another perspective. So on your music, right? Like, so if you're, doing everything at home, there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that, you've written the song maybe by yourself, you've engineered it or recorded it, however, at home. And then, it's always nice to just have another perspective on your art and getting some outside input can be really beneficial. The other part is, like you mentioned, I have collected over the past several years a big library of high quality plugins, and a lot of them are emulations of gear that I actually used, when I was making these records, so I worked on large format consoles, like the Neves, as well as SSL. And now, I mean, it's wonderful. I'm a fan. Now I have those consoles in plugin form, right in my laptop. And as you said, I know, I really did my apprenticeship in the music industry, sitting behind some of the top mixers and engineers and producers in the world. Some of my friends, like I worked very closely with Mick Gazowski, who's won multiple Grammys. I mean, I've worked on records myself that have won multiple records I worked on have won Grammys, but Mick is one of the top mixing and recording engineers in the world. So he won for that. He engineered and mixed that Daft Punk record that won Best Album of the Year. He mixed Eric Clapton's record, the one with My Father's Eyes on it. And then, over the course of my years, I've worked with multiple top mixers and engineers. So I bring all that knowledge of how I use today's tools. I bring that to everything that I do. It doesn't matter if it's an indie band or, someone who's more seasoned as an artist. I just know how I would do things in the big studio, and I use those same techniques as well as more advanced techniques. I've continued I love the fact that YouTube has, there's access to so many great top engineers and producers, and they're sharing their knowledge, which is something that we did. I loved about the fact working at Conway. Conway has 3 studios, and all of us, all the engineers and producers, we would all share our tips and tricks. And I've continued to stay up on the latest methods of how things are done in the box now. And so bottom line is, I just bring all that experience and how I mix a record or a song in the box the same as I would approach it as being in the studio on a large format console. So there's not a lot of people that have had that experience, and it really just could take your music to the next level, which is that brings me a lot of joy and pleasure is to do that, help people up their game, and just a different take. It's why you see top artists, like Taylor Swift, Ariana Grande, they hire, these top mixers because they have their vision for their song, but then they turn it over and let the mixer take it to the next level.
So one of the aspects of the project that you and I have worked together that I was very interested in, because I have never done this before, was that the question of how do you want to deliver the music you've recorded to the mixing engineer?
Right.
Obviously, most people who are recording, they have set a certain sound for each and every instrument. They've picked the kit that they want to use for their drums. They have their amplifier and guitar settings, or more likely, their Helix settings for their guitar, whatever system they might be using for that. They're clearly recording that guitar, that instrument, not bare with no effects on it. They're going to deliver those effects to you. And let's take a simple one like reverb. One of the things I was really intrigued by when you sent back the first mix to me was, wow, this reverb just sounds awesome. And I had reverb on this track, and I ended up actually removing the reverb from vocal tracks, for example, to let you apply, to the bare recording, those effects. So give me a little guidance on that. What is the artist usually delivering to the mixing engineer?
So that's a great question. And it's, there's not one specific answer to it. Like in terms of reverb, that's one of the things that I would prefer, to have a dry vocal. Now, dry vocals are a separate case. Usually I like to have a dry vocal with it could have EQ or a little bit of compression on it is totally fine. But I prefer to get vocals with no reverb and no effects. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't have the same track, a duplicate of that track with your effects and with your reverb so that I can hear, one of the first things you do as a mix engineer is you want to listen to the rough mix of what the artist provides. And, you need to ask the question, hey, is this the direction that you would like to go, or I should take it and push it further in that direction? But in terms of vocals specifically, I prefer to at least have the option of a vocal with no effects on it. Like I said, you can always have a second track with the effects that you like, and then I can listen to that and use it. Reverb's a different story because a lot of times it's harder to control reverb that's already put on a track. I do have a couple plugins where you can sort of turn that down, but I'd rather just get it without it. In terms of other instruments, like guitars and things like that, it's always good if you can to have a DI track on the guitar. But I'd like to hear, you're a guitar player and you have your rig and all your sounds. So I'd like to hear tracks with those sounds and those effects. Those, that's fine. But providing a DI is, which means for those of you that don't know, DI is just a direct input from the guitar. So there's no effects on it, no amplifier. But I do like getting guitars that have amplifiers recorded or even an amp simulation. The one thing that I would caution is that a lot of times I get guitar tracks that are overly distorted. So if I don't have the guitar DI where I can then go and reamp it through a plugin, overly distorted guitars are really hard to deal with. And that's one thing that I would caution your viewers is that try not to overly distort guitars. Even if you want shredding, heavy electric guitars, that's fine. But just make sure that it's not overly distorted.
I've seen more than one recording engineer really suggest, you've got that DI because so often he is having to send the artist back, go record this again. It was too hot.
Yeah. And now when we talk about distortion, there's two aspects. One is you want to get a decent level on the track itself, but you don't want it to clip. So if you look at the waveform, you never want to see the waveform hitting the tops of the track. And then you'll see it squared off. That's digital clipping. You never want that.
Right.
You want a decent level so that you get all the bits, right? Digital is made up of a certain number of bits depending on your bit depth. So you don't want something that is just like super tiny. You want decent level. But the distortion part is actually, there's so many plugins and amp simulators now that you can put on amp distortion. And that's where, you don't want it to clip and you don't want to overly distort it through your amplifier or through your amp plugin. So that's what I'm talking about.
Gotcha. Now, and I don't want to deep dive on this, but I guess that one observation I have is that more and more these days, really major artists are doing tons of recording and their own full mixing at home and really coming out with incredibly good results. Billie Eilish and her brother popped to mind.
Yeah, sure.
But most of us who may be recording don't necessarily have those chops. But would you agree that a lot of those settings are becoming a bigger part of what the artist is producing, and then they want
Yes.
to mix that highly produced sound together with all the other instruments and work with somebody like yourself to do that.
Absolutely. And that's why I was saying that, the first thing you do as a mixing engineer is listen to the rough mix, right? So it's not that we don't want all those great tones and flavors and effects. It's just there are times when it's too much, and then I would have trouble making it sound as good as it can, which is why that's why you want to, if you possibly can, you want to have a dry vocal track, and you want to have a DI for guitar and a DI for the bass. But having those, I come from the days of 24 track analog mixing, and I watched these documentaries, and it was my experience all the time. The fact that you only had 24 tracks causes you to make some decisions, which is great. It's just a matter of these days. I see things have gone the other way. I was watching a breakdown of this mix that one of the engineers did, and he said that the artist had sent him a track that had 200 tracks. So nowadays it's the opposite. People won't make decisions, and because they can create 200 tracks, then they kind of do. So it did definitely impacted being creative within constraints, made you record differently. So I just watched the breakdown of Rick Beato did this amazing interview with Queen's guitarist Brian May, and they did that Bohemian Rhapsody on 24 track, and they had to get their balances on the vocals right, and then they had to get their whatever effects they were adding, they had to get those right, and they kept bouncing them down. That's how they built up this lush orchestral sound to it. So they were fully committed to that. And then once you do that, the Beatles worked that way. They only had 4 tracks to make Sgt. Pepper's, or if that was 4 tracks or 8 tracks. So those are the limitations, and sometimes you make that choice and then you're stuck with it, but that's just, it is what it is. So recording has definitely changed, actually for the better in a lot of ways. I love the fact that I can sit at home and have access to all these tools that would be, you would have to go into a top studio and hundreds of thousands of dollars of gear. Everyone has access to it. So long story short is, people shouldn't limit their creativity. It's just a nice to have if you can have some of those direct or dry tracks.
Well, another interesting aspect of that, and a segue to something, a practical thing that I want to talk about for the benefit of people that are thinking of working with a mixing engineer. I'll add a track just to do 10-second lick on a guitar.
Yeah.
And
that's totally fine.
Sure, it's fine today. But when in the 24 track, that you'd have to really mess around with that to get it to work. But
what we would have to do, working on a 2-inch 24 track, is you would have to find an open spot, and it could be on a vocal track, it could be on a piano solo, it could be, and then you basically have to find that little spot. It was nerve-wracking because you wanted to make sure that you got in and out, punched in and out into record and out of record before you ran into that whatever that performance was. And then during mix time, you molt that out of the tape machine to its own fader. But yeah, we don't have to do that, and that's totally fine. That's actually preferable to do that nowadays. Now we don't have to really think about it. Just go ahead and put it on another track.
So the practical aspect, one of the practical aspects that I really wanted to talk about with you, and that you and I worked together on, was, okay, I've decided to work with the outside mix engineer, and I've found somebody to work with. That person has a DAW or more than one DAW. I have a DAW or more than one DAW, but it may not be the same DAW.
Yeah.
And so you've got to be able to get your music into a format that you can share with your mix engineer and back and forth sometimes.
Yes.
And you also have to have the mechanics for doing that. And those things are much, much easier than I would have thought, but it is something that you have to think through. Now, in my case, I'm using Digital Performer. I'm not even sure what DAW you're using.
I am. I've used obviously Pro Tools in the past. That was the kind of still is sort of the de facto standard, just because everyone started using Pro Tools. But and I've used Logic as well. Those are the two main DAWs that I used to use. But for the past several years, I've used a DAW called Reaper, which I've told you a bit about. And I would highly suggest your viewers watching this look into it, because Reaper was created by these genius audio computer engineers, and it's basically, you can use it for free for 30 or 60 days. But then just to actually purchase a copy for your own use is like $60. And even if you're making, it depends on how much money you're actually making. I think the top cost is like $250, but just to get started, Reaper has been wonderful for me. I've learned it over the years. It's highly configurable and customizable, and I just love it. Like nowadays, if I have to go back and mix on Pro Tools, there's functionality that's missing on Pro Tools that I can do easily on Reaper. Now, I've gotten great results with Pro Tools as well. So bottom line is, I use Reaper. It's my DAW of choice. And I'm mixing your song in Reaper. And you bring up a good point. So the engineer might not have the same DAW or use the same DAW as you do. So two ways to get projects across. If you happen to be working in the same, whether it's Logic or Digital Performer or Pro Tools, if your engineer happens to work in that DAW, then you can actually just share your entire project with them, and you don't really have to worry too much about it. It's just making sure that all the files get transferred in the full project.
Now, in our case, we were not working with the same DAW, and I would say I'm guessing that would come up a lot out there.
Absolutely.
There's so many DAWs that are really excellent, all different price ranges. And somebody may have the same DAW, but it's probably not unlikely that you won't have it. I was quite surprised at how relatively easy it was for me to put my project, to put my tracks into a format that I could send over to you.
Yes.
And you were able to pick them up. Now, there were two aspects of that. One was, what format did you need from me?
Mm-hmm.
How did I produce that format inside my DAW? And then how did I get the files to you? And you had, we did have a conversation about, what bit depth, what kilohertz, the recording was at, and that type of thing. But I'm really interested in how much you feel people need to, quote unquote, worry about that these days. I think it wasn't that long ago that even with DAWs, you did have to be more concerned about that. But now all the DAWs seem to be able to pick it up almost no matter what format that you send over. So talk about that a little bit, if you would.
So that is a good point. The mixing engineer will most likely, unless you're recording it and have been working in Pro Tools, they might not. There's a high percentage that they probably don't want to mix in that or don't have that DAW. So what I started doing years ago, it's pretty common in Pro Tools. There's a function called consolidation. So consolidation means having every single track, no matter what's on it, or no matter how big or small, or that track plays, is having it from bar 1, beat 1, which is at 0, all the way through to the end of the song. So having all of your tracks be exported or
Full length
consolidated.
tracks. Yeah.
Say again.
The full length of
Full
of
length.
the longest track, 0
Right.
to however
So
long.
it goes right from 0 or bar one, beat one, all the way to the absolute end. All the tracks should be exported at the same length. And what that does is it allows all the tracks, it allows me to, as a mixing engineer, to take that those tracks and just put it into my into Reaper, into my DAW, and I just line it all up right at the very start, and that way everything stays in sync, and you don't have to worry. Now, you know, the other part of that is the fact that none of your settings will, unless you've printed the effects or the EQ or the compression, those settings won't come across, which is fine as long as, you know, I have a reference mix, you know, a rough mix as a reference. But that's the easiest way to do it. Now, when I told you about that, Kent, you went into Digital Performer, and what was that called in Digital Performer?
They had a merge audio
A merge
function, which essentially did what Consolidated. It went through track by track by track, made each track the same length, and converted it to the WAV or AIFF or whatever format we agreed on.
Yes.
For each one. But one really, really important note that I can't stress enough, I made a complete and total copy of my project, including all audio and shared library files before I did that. And I made sure I was working in that copy so that I wasn't touching my original work. And I think that's a really important reminder for everyone.
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of saving and backing up multiple times. DAWs these days usually have a function where you can say, you know, make this a standalone version so that if you have to hand it off to somebody else, that all, like you said, all your files, all your, not just your audio files, but all your library, whatever things that, like for me, you know, sometimes I'll use a reverb that needs an impulse response, and it will pull that impulse response file into that project. So it's the full project. In your case, I just used what you sent me, which was basically just all the tracks merged and consolidated from the top to the end, and it worked out great. You know, I don't think DAWs these days actually will support various bit rates, sampling rates, and bit depths, and
very dynamically.
Yeah, I don't think that should be a problem. The other thing that's good, the things that I want to know getting a track is I want to know what the tempo of the track is in beats per minute, BPM. And it's also helpful to know what the key of the track is in. So that's those two pieces of information, along with the rough mix. So those are the things that I would ask an artist or band to send over to me.
Now, what about, you know, this is, as far as I know, this is 100% about audio. What about MIDI tracks? You're not really going to get those over or do anything with those usually, is that correct?
Actually, well, no, MIDI is the same thing. You want to have, if you have MIDI tracks, that opens up even more possibilities. Like for your song, for example, the drums are mixed down to 2 tracks, so I don't have access to the individual drums like the kick and the snare and the toms. And
the one time I didn't also record the drums in MIDI because I record with V drums. So
it's nice to have that MIDI, and that would come over, you know, MIDI track, even though it's different information than audio information, that would come over in the same format. It would, same format meaning the same configuration, so that it would be from bar 1, beat 1, all the way to the end. And then just having those, even if I didn't use them, that would be nice to have, especially for things like drums or keyboards. It also leaves the door open, once again, for, you know, if we got through a mix and there was a problem with one of the synth pads or patches, you as the artist could easily go back and change that synth pad and re-export it and send it over to me, and then I could drop it in. So having the MIDI is nice, not necessary, but a nice to have.
Now, one thing that you already touched on is that in sending the audio files over to you, there's no data in those audio files to allow you to pull that up into your DAW and see any of the settings that were used on a reverb track or any other effect, much less anything, plugins and things like that. So you're not getting that information unless you have the same DAW, and I'm actually sharing the entire DAW project with you, and you have the same plugins I have.
That is correct, and that's another good point too. Is everyone has a different set of plugins. So unless now each DAW has their own plugins that come with the DAW itself, but there's things that there's plugins that people buy and collect over the years. So that's another good point.
Today's environment is for a relatively inexpensive $20 a month subscription. I might get access to entire libraries of plugins, and there's thousands of them.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great point. I think we have. I'm definitely guilty of this plugin fever, and what drives that for me is just the fact that there's a piece of gear. A perfect example is like the Fairchild stereo limiter and compressor. In the studio, like we had one of those in our studio, but it was one instance and it cost $30,000. Now I have the Fairchild plug-in, and I can use that, which I got for whatever, 20, 30 bucks, and I can use that on as many tracks as I want. So that's what drives me, is that knowing what those pieces of gear could do in the real world and having access to it. It's still a hobby for me. So
now,
gone overboard there a bit.
I have to ask you, and this is a memory function, I guess, but you worked on the actual Fairchild, the $30,000 unit. Then you worked with the $30 plug-in.
Yes.
Do you feel that the plugin has the integrity that it actually sounds like and does what that Fairchild
is? These days, absolutely. I'm a big fan of Plugin Alliance, and they have this modeling technology, or even Waves. The audio software engineers, they actually take, like, for example, I use the JJ Puig Fairchild, for example, the plugin. They actually took his Fairchild from his studio, was his favorite Fairchild compressor, and they modeled it. So absolutely, these days, it is so close that it doesn't even matter, right? And even if it didn't sound exactly like the actual hardware, who cares? It's the end result that counts. But I know what different compressors and different equalizers do, and how I would use them in the studio, and what the things that I would use them on. And having access to the exact ones, like whether it's like the LA2A or the 1176 or the Fairchild, it's just, I know, okay, I want to use, like on a snare drum or something, yeah, let me try this 1176. So I don't think the quality is so good now, Kent, that people don't have to worry about any of that stuff. That if you buy a Fairchild plugin, it's getting you in the ballpark, if not exactly getting the same result as you would with a $30,000 piece of hardware. And then one more point is the fact that you don't have the issues that you have with the hardware. So now if I go into a studio, you have to turn the knobs, and there might be some static, or a switch is not working. Like those old Fairchilds, or even the 1176s, their components, even the consoles. So working on the big, large format consoles, the actual components wear out. And that's why those big studios have a chief technician, and their job is to make sure when you press a button that it works and it's not adding any noise. And I love not having to deal with that nowadays.
Now, one of the things that I was very interested in, something that would have been, I record the song that we're working on together, Love Gamble, was recorded 20 years ago. And even though I worked on Digital Performer at that time, and you would have had whatever DAW you had at that time, there are some things that would have been very significant issues for us to be able to work together the way that we did, all
Yeah,
online. I mean, because of
good.
COVID and other things, I haven't seen you since I don't know when, but
I
uh,
know, and
you
we don't
know,
live very far apart.
back then, exchanging files of the size that we're exchanging would have been a chore.
Yeah.
Probably would have had to been done on physical media.
Yes.
But now that's become a non-issue, not only from the standpoint of hundreds of gigabytes are something that we can relatively easily exchange in many different ways, but also being able to easily do it through numerous different services. Now, you had originally recommended Dropbox, and I don't use Dropbox or have a Dropbox account, so I just said, well, I can just do this via Google.
Yep.
And we really easily were able to exchange files back and forth.
Yeah, it's wonderful. We used to have to literally send drives with gigabytes of data and information back and forth, or master tapes, right? Like, having a record, made on 2-inch tapes, right? So we would have 2-inch tapes are really beefy, right? They're like this big and they're heavy, and you have to worry about, a lot of people would end up with 2-inch tapes they would put in their closet, and unfortunately they would put them on top of a speaker. So the magnets in the speaker were affecting what's been recorded on the tapes. So there's, I used to be hyper vigilant about, you have to store this at a certain temperature. You can make sure no magnets. So we don't have to worry about any of that, which is wonderful. And just using a cloud service and having a decently fast internet connection has made the transfer process super easy.
So one practical aspect of that. So I agree with you that I think it's really easy for anybody to be able to set up with services they may already be using, like Google or Microsoft or whatever, a way to get the files to you. But the names of the files, I'm sure you can figure things out, although having to listen to an entire track to know what it is when there's only 10 seconds of music on it is so. But so track names can be important, and
well, absolutely, and that was important even back in the analog days. It's just nice to have a naming convention, like things for vocal, just VOC is good. Knowing if it's a lead vocal, so I use, either just type it out, lead vocal, or LD vocal.
are there
Double.
industry standards for naming conventions that you know of?
I don't think there are actually, but it's something that you just get in the habit of. For me, in a DAW, I like to see as much of the name that I can so that I know what the track actually is on the faders in my DAW. So that means having the first 4 to 6 to 8 letters of the track name be understandable, so that's just using some of those abbreviations is really nice. And also, for, let's say you have stereo guitars, having it say
Left,
rhythm
right.
guitar left and rhythm guitar right says to me that, okay, this is a stereo pair and I can pan them left and right appropriately.
Now, you can combine multiple, let's say that you've got that 10-second clip of a guitar. You can combine different things on a single track, but then that makes it difficult for you. So these days, you really just want individual tracks to be the same instrument with that same setting.
So in terms of, these days, you wouldn't necessarily want to or need to put a vocal on a guitar track, right? You can, but then I would just chop it up and separate them out, which
you're going to end up separating them anyway.
But, one of the things another thing that you want to do, Kent, is I would say naming the tracks so that they would sort properly. So I would like to see, here's all the drum tracks. Like if you sent me your project, your output of your project, it would be really great. So all the drums, would be together. So that's what I do anyway. If I get a project, and this is just from habit, from working on, in the big studios on large consoles, is, I have all my bass tracks at the beginning of the song, and then I do my drum tracks. So it would be bass DI, bass amp, and then drum tracks. So it will be just starting for kick drum, snare drum, toms, hi-hat, overheads, room mics. Samples would be sorted in with, like if you had a recorded kick and a kick sample, and a recorded snare and a snare sample, just put them together. And that's the first thing I do when I get a project, is I go ahead and just arrange it. Like I said, it's bass, drums, could be vocals, then guitars, synths, and any other instruments, is how I lay things out.
So the bottom line is that the more work I can do to make sure that the track names
Yes.
are easy to understand and group together, the less work you're going to have to do.
Absolutely.
There's probably always going to be a little bit of work you have to do. Now, one thing I found interesting about that was I tried to have the discipline even 20 years ago to immediately name an audio track what it was before I started recording, because the default name that a DAW is going to give a track is audio-01 or whatever. And even if I later renamed it, the audio tracks were always going to be audio-01.1.2.3.
Right. And that's a great point, Kent. Doing that, I think, will make everyone's life easier.
But here's one of the points I wanted to make, is that your project may have that problem. And in that case, you've either got to create a cross reference for the mixing engineer or manually rename the tracks with that more descriptive name. So that's just a practical aspect I wanted to be sure to get as part of our conversation here.
I would highly recommend that if you did not name your tracks, like as a mixer, I don't want to go in and I don't want to figure out what is this track and then go in and name stuff. I want the artist or the band to do that and provide that with me when it comes over, because the less that I have to focus on, kind of the logistics of things, and more I can just focus on, hey, listening to the music, listening to the rough mix, and thinking about where I want to take it, the better for me.
I think one other aspect I just want to touch on, but not really deep dive on, is I think an early decision that you've got to make is, I'm sending my project out to the mixing engineer. We've already talked about the fact that I made a backup to do that, and I've changed the format of the audio files with my consolidation function or my merge function or whatever it's called. Do I even anticipate the possibility I'm going to try to bring tracks back and do more stuff with them? I would say if the answer is yes, I am going to try to do that. That really is a little bit of a hairy proposition.
I think that's a good point as well, Kent. Unless the artist or the band requests that let's say I did some really cool effect on the vocal or the guitar track or something, you could then ask me to go ahead and print that effect. And then I would do the same thing. I would print it from top of the song to the end of the song. And I could then give you that track, and it has the effect built into it, or has it separate, right? I could also you could have your guitar track that you sent me, and then just all the effects that I sent, that I added, I could print that to another track. It's kind of unusual to do it that way, especially if you're not working in the same DAW.
So last thing along those lines, Gary, so you've done a mix, and I'm not going to try to do anything else to it. You've done the mix, so you're delivering a stereo, track back to me.
Yes.
do I consider that mastered or that at that point, or do I still have to go have it mastered or do the mastering work myself?
So that's another great point too. That is not necessarily mastered. Now, I'm not a mastering engineer, and the records I worked on obviously were sent out to some of the top mastering engineers in the world. You know, Bernie Grumman, Bob Ludwig, George Marino. So I do highly recommend, if you can afford it, is to have a mastering engineer take the stereo master that I would send back to you, and have it mastered professionally. But, you know, I can, and I do provide two different types of mixes. One is an unmastered version at the highest quality. So that would be, in your case, I think it was either
192, yeah.
44 and 44 or 48 kilohertz and 24 bit depth. But I also, you know, I do use things like ozone and have some other mastering quality equalizers and compressors that I use. So I can do a quick master and provide that to you as a separate file. But I would certainly call out, we would have a discussion saying, hey, you know, if you plan on having this professionally mastered, then I would actually adjust what I send to you accordingly.
I'd be really interested to know the God stats on how many tracks are being still professionally mastered versus someone picking up an ozone type product and
right.
doing their mastering with that. I'm sure
I
there's a
think
growing number.
I think the top artists, you know, that you hear on the radio or you know, streaming services usually still have a mastering engineer master their music. But these days, once again, like you said, Billie Eilish, for a perfect example, or whoever is, you know, someone like deadmau5 or any of those, you know, EDM guys, you can do it all, you know, right at home. Whether you should do it all, that's, if the end result sounds good to you, then it's good, right? That's really a basic philosophy of audio and sound engineering and mixing. Is it, if it sounds good, it is, right? But if you want your mix to translate across, you know, you know, these days people aren't listening on speakers, they're listening on earbuds, or they're listening from their iPhone or a Bluetooth speaker. That's where mastering engineer really comes in handy. They have the ability to make your music sound good no matter what people are listening on. The other aspect to that, Kent, is understanding, you know, when you master a song, if you're mastering yourself, if you're mastering for the streaming services, you know, they have a certain, it's called Luft is their setting, you know, I believe it's Luft minus 14 is the level that they want it at. Otherwise, they're just going to either turn it down or turn your music up. So there is a lot involved, as you know, on the technical side, but it doesn't mean that people can't do it at home. It's just that, you know, if you can afford it, it's always good to have a mastering engineer will do all that for you.
Well, Gary, one final kind of practical aspect of the file transfers and all that type of thing that I wanted to cover real quickly. In my video that I produced for the process that I went through to get the files to you from Digital Performer, the merge function, locating the files, putting them in the Google Drive, that kind of thing. I was interested in having you show us what the result was when you pulled it into your DAW, what it looked like, and then what you were able to do from there. And you mentioned the name of the DAW that you were using, and obviously I'm sure that's what you're going to pull up. So let's just take a quick look at that, if that's okay.
Sure, that's fine. Once again, I'm using Reaper. And,
okay.
Let me share my screen here. I have to tilt the camera down for a minute to do that. So this is this is Reaper. This is one of my favorite DAWs to work in, and if I have a choice, I love mixing in Reaper. And this is actually the project for Kent's song called Love Gamble. What I'm going to do is I'm going to switch modes. So I'm going to remove the mixer here, the mix panel, and then this is what Kent sent me. All these different tracks. I'm going to close this up so you can see some of the other tracks. But as you can see, everything starts right at the very top, except for some tracks like this drum track here that you're seeing. I actually shortened that audio file, meaning I just brought it in because it was just empty tracks. But if you look at like these blue tracks here, which are Kent's lead guitar tracks, they all start, the bass tracks, which are in red, they all start at the very top. And then, they go, let me slide this across, and they go all the way to the end. So you can see that they all end at the same point. And that's when we were talking earlier about either consolidation or merging. That's what I got from the tracks that Kent sent over to me. And then I just drop and drag the audio files into the project. And I know, if I put everything right at the very top, that it'll all line up and it'll all be in phase, and it's great to work with that way. So that's just a look at, Kent sent those tracks over to me, which he showed you how to prepare, and this is how I received them and brought them into my DAW, Reaper.
So, and then from there, you were able to, I'm sure you didn't necessarily touch every single track with effects or anything like that, but what you did want to do, you were able to do every one of them.
Yeah. Well, the ones that are ending up in the mix, yes, I touched every single track.
Okay. And you were able to use your Reaper tools, your plugins to do that.
Yeah, I'm going to bring up the mixer now. So this can show you, here's a view that shows you all the different plugins that I use on various tracks. Now, the ones that are kind of in this lightish orange are bypassed. The ones that are in white are the ones that I'm actually using. And what I'll do as I get close to the end of a mix sometimes is I'll just remove the plugins that I'm not using at all. But you can see, here. So all of these guitar tracks, even though I ended up only using one, I have my guitar master track, but that's just the master track opened up so you can see all the individual tracks. And then as I scroll through the song, or through the mixer, you'll see all the different effects and effect sends and effects returns that I used in the song. So quite a lot, but not overly crazy, but just crazy enough to be fun.
Yeah, this particular project did not involve that many source tracks from me to you. Maybe there was 11 or 12 or something like that. But the nice thing is that because you're not counting on having to send all this back to me for any reason, you're able to do what you want to do and what you need to do to get the mix that you want.
That is correct.
All right.
I basically, as I mentioned earlier, I put the tracks in the sequential order that I want, which are bass guitar, drums, and then usually have guitars, vocals, synths down at the other end.
That's great. Thank you for taking a little bit of time to show us the receiving end of what I sent over, Gary. Absolutely. That's terrific.
Yeah, and it was, as Kent said, I think he was sort of shocked that it was so easy. And it really is, it's just a few little rules, just everything start at the top and end at the same point. And it does make it super easy to get things to an external mixer.
Well, Gary, this has been awesome. I guess there's just one more thing that I want to touch on for the benefit of our viewers. You know, the first time you work with an attorney, you find out very quickly why you don't want to have too many conversations and get to be pals, because they all show up on the bill. Now I know there's different arrangements that you can have with a mix engineer on the outside, but if you're paying by the hour, you know, there are some things you want to be aware of. So, you know, not everybody has a great friend named Gary who's going to work with you gratis and put the number of hours you put in on this project for me, and I'll have other ways that I can repay you, I'm sure. But if I'm on the clock, you know, what are some of the things that you think viewers should consider about how they set up that arrangement with a mix engineer?
Sure. As you mentioned, you know, there's a couple of different ways in terms of paying a mix engineer to work on your music. One is hourly, but then there's the other method, which is just charging by this per song. And, you know, I kind of like working on a per song basis. I can experiment and do things, you know, take some time. The artist knows that, well, here's what it's going to cost. Now, within reason, right? So that fee per song would include 1 or 2 revisions. So if like I sent your mix back and I asked you, you know, is the vocal feel good to you, Ken, or does it need to be louder or softer? Then, you know, that would be included, that revision would be included in that original price per song. I think no matter what mode you're working with your engineer, whether it's an hourly rate or it's on a per song basis, is you still want to be organized and get into those good habits of naming your tracks properly, making sure all the elements are in the project folder. That's just good methodology to, you know, get good habits to be in moving forward, no matter how you're working with your mix engineer. Like I said, you know, doing it on a per song basis benefits, you know, usually benefits the artist, but it allows me as a mixer to do some experimentation, knowing that, you know, I'm not on the clock per se. And if you are working on an hourly basis, then I would just be concise with whatever your comments and feedback are. And, you know, be respectful of the engineer's time. You know, everyone's needs to pay the rent and put food on the table. And, you know, just be, you just want to watch your budget and make sure that you're organized with your comments and feedback as well as your projects.
Good advice. Gary, I want to thank you so much for joining us for this session. It's been awesome, and I hope that we can do some more on some other topics in the future. I have found you an absolute fountain of knowledge and information and experience in many areas that I hope you can share with our viewers here on Happy Place Home Studio.
My pleasure, Kent. Just let me know. Happy to talk about and share all this knowledge that I've learned over the years. And just want to say best of luck to everyone. Like, you know, keep going. That's the thing, is just keep creating and making music and writing songs, and you will get better at your craft. And, you know, if you love it like I do, then it will make your life happier and more enjoyable. So I will talk to you soon, Kent, and be happy to come back and visit you again.
Thanks, Gary.
Sure thing.
I'd like to thank my friend Gary Wagner, not only for working with us to do the mix on Love Gamble, but also for spending the time today to give us some really great practical information and advice on how to work with an external mix engineer. Now, as promised, we're going to do a little A/B, give a little A/B listen to the original mix of Love Gamble and Gary's mix of Love Gamble. And there's just a few things I need to tell you about it, because it's really not an apples for apples comparison, to be honest. For one thing, the original 20-year-old cut of Love Gamble was never professionally mastered. I mastered it somewhat with my DAW and did the mix myself. Gary's mix I have had professionally mastered in preparation for release through DistroKid. So that's one thing that's not very comparable. The other thing is that I added a sax part to Love Gamble for the Wagner mix, and that obviously is very, very different. But you can still, especially in the parts where the sax is not prominent, you can definitely hear the differences between the two mixes. And just like anything, it's a matter of taste. I really like Gary's mix. I think he did a great job. One other thing I want to point out is that often, if you're going to work with a mix engineer, you will literally probably provide them with every track. And I did not do that. I mixed it down to a certain point myself and provided those tracks. So Gary could have done a lot of different things if he, for example, had all the sax parts. But I recorded the saxophone with 3 different microphones. There were a lot of parts, and so I just gave him the mic mix that I selected for the saxophone, for example. So let's give a listen to the A/B of the original recording of Love Gamble from 20 years ago and Gary Wagner's mixed and mastered version. This is the original. It's Gary's mix. Really miss that sax when it's not there.
Do you see what I see? Do you care about what's important to me? Does the world pass you by? Do you shape it well? Do you even try? If I listen to my heart, would this ever start?
Definitely a different mix on the vocalist.
Trying to learn how to play the love gamble. Love gamble. If I'm marching with the sign, are you the next to be in line? You repay my trust with loyalty. Should our chances lover, house has all that's covered? Do I fall down this manhole? Leave my life in shambles. Play the love gamble.
Comes the lead. The guitar lead was replaced with a sax lead.
Should I chance this lover? The house has all that's covered. Do I fall down this manhole? Leave my life in shambles. Play the
distinctly different mixes. I'd like to add a very, very special thank you to my good friend Cliff McKinley, who did a fantastic job on the saxophone and, in fact, helped me record one of our chapters here on Happy Place Home Studio, recording a sax. So check that out if you're interested. I hope you've enjoyed this interview with the producer and a mix of Love Gamble. We'll see you soon again at Happy Place Home Studio.